Hello, friends. Welcome to Literary Concepts. Today's topic is Renaissance criticism. Now, let us try to understand about the Renaissance criticism in a brief manner. Introduction part: the Renaissance, which was happened. Renaissance means, in simple terms, rebirth. So, which was occurred during 14th to 17th century. In between 14th to 17th century, it was a period of profound cultural, intellectual, and artistic transformation that deeply influenced the evolution of literary criticism. So, Renaissance period was a great cultural and intellectual and artistic transformation period, and that influenced the development of literary criticism. This particular Renaissance period influenced the evolution and the development of literary criticism. So it was originated in revival of classical learning. So it is rooted in the revival of the classical learning. Classical learning means here learning about the ancient Greek and Latin texts. Understand? And the Renaissance criticism was a combination of both the ancient Greek and Roman ideas with the contemporary humanist thought. So blends it blends both the ancient Greek and Roman ideas along with the contemporary humanist thought of Renaissance time. So the historical context. Now let us try to understand about the historical context. So the Renaissance began in Italy in the 14th century and spread across Europe. So it was started in Italy during 14th century, and it was spread across the Europe. So the invention of the printing press, that is around 1440. So the printing press invention was happened around 1440, so which helped for the dissemination of classical text and inspiring renewed interest in ancient works. So the invention of the development of printing press helped facilitated for the spread of the classical texts and inspired the renewed interest, the revival interest in ancient works, that is, in the works of ancient Greek and Latin. So, this period witnessed a shift from medieval scholasticism to humanism. So, scholasticism means a way of thinking and teaching knowledge, so which emphasizes tradition and dogma. Scholasticism is a method of thinking and teaching knowledge, so which emphasizing tradition and dogma to humanism. So the Renaissance period also emphasizing individual potential, so that is the individual capacity and the study of humanities subjects like literature, history, and philosophy. So literary criticism evolved to reflect the humanist focus on classical texts, moral instruction, and artistic excellence. So literary criticism developed, developed to reflect that human concerns, which focus on classical texts, the ancient Greek and Latin texts, and moral teachings, and artistic excellence. Understand? Now let us try to understand the characteristics of Renaissance criticism. So the first one is revival of classical learning. That is, the revival of classical traditions. So revival, so that is a betterment and renewed interest. Okay, improvement of classical tradition. So we see that there is a strong interest, a renewed interest in the works of Aristotle, Horace, Cicero, and Plato during the Renaissance criticism. So The critics had interest in, they showed interest in the works of Aristotle, Horace, and Cicero, and Plato. So it was a rediscovery and translation of classical texts. So they focused on the rediscovering and translation of that classical text. So well knowledgeable of the principles of Renaissance literary theory. Understand. So rediscovering and translation of classical text informed, that is knowledgeable, the principles, the beliefs of Renaissance literary theory. So, the revival of classical tradition is the first characteristic of Renaissance criticism. The second one is humanism. So, humanism focuses on human experiences. It gives prominence to human experience, dignity, and the moral purpose of literature. Renaissance criticism here focuses on human experience, dignity, and moral purpose of literature. The critics of Renaissance criticism seek to reconcile, understand, so to restore the classical ideals with Christian values. They wanted to reconcile, to reunite, and restore the classical ideas, the classical beliefs with Christian values. The next characteristic is imitation and innovation. Imitation means following, innovation means something uh, inventing new. So, Renaissance critics, so criticism advocates imitating classical methods. Here, the critics advocated for imitating classical models, while emphasizing creative innovation. At the same time, they follow they followed the classical models, the classical texts, as well as they emphasize that creativity and innovation in their criticism, and it was encouraged writers, okay, during this time. So writers were encouraged to surpass their classical predecessors, to surpass, excel their, okay, go beyond their classical predecessors. So that is the precursors, the classical critics, the classical writers. The next characteristic is moral and didactic function. Didactic means teaching, teaching morals. So literature was seen as a vehicle. During Renaissance time, the literature was considered, it was a vehicle for moral instruction, moral teachings, and social refinement, social betterment. And critics of during Renaissance time, they valued works which promoted virtue, that is goodness, and civic responsibility, social responsibility. So the works which promoted goodness, virtue, and civic responsibility, for such works the critics valued during Renaissance criticism. The next characteristic is aesthetic principles, the aesthetic beliefs. So Renaissance criticism emphasizes on harmony, peace, understand, proportion. So that is a portion or division, and decorum, dignity and decency, politeness, inspired by classical ideals. So these aspects, harmony, proportion, decorum, these aspects were inspired by the classical ideals. So these things also we find during the Renaissance period. The major critics and their contributions during Renaissance criticism. The first critic is Dante Alighieri, whose time period started in 1265 and continued up to 1321. So here Dante Alighieri's important works, De Vulgari Eloquentia, on eloquence in the vernacular, and the next one is the Divine Comedy. So his important contributions to Renaissance criticism was, he defended the use of vernacular languages over Latin for literary expressions. So he supported for the use of local languages, vernacular native languages over the Latin for literary expression. To express, to write, so instead of using Latin, so he supported for use of native languages. And Dante Alighieri explored the role of poetry in moral and spiritual education. So he focused more on the role of poetry in spreading the moral and spiritual education. So these are the two important contributions made by Dante Alighieri during Renaissance criticism. The next critic is Giovanni Boccaccio, whose time period started in 1313 and continued up to 1375. His important works, Genealogia Deorum Gentilium, so that is genealogy of gods of the Gentiles, and the next work is Decameron, very important one, popular one, Decameron. So his important contributions to Renaissance criticism are he advocated the study of classical mythology to understand literature. He supported to study the classical mythology to understand the literature, and he promoted storytelling as a tool for entertainment and instruction. So, the storytelling is a tool, weapon for entertainment. It is a media for entertainment and medium for entertainment and instruction. The next critic is Francisco Petrarch, whose time period started in 1304 and continued up to 1374. So his important works are various essays and sonnets. Petrarchan sonnets are very popular. So his key contribution to Renaissance criticisms are he was considered as father of Renaissance humanism. Francisco Petrarch was considered as father of Renaissance humanism, who emphasizes the moral purpose of literature. He emphasized the moral purpose of literature, and he advocated for the fusion of classical learning with Christian principles. So combining of the classical learning with Christian beliefs and principles. The next critic is Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney, whose time period started in 1554 and ended in 1586. His important work is An Apology for Poetry. That is the another title is The Defense of Poesy, An Apology for Poetry, or The Defense of Poesy. His important contributions are he defended poetry against Puritan attacks that viewed it as frivolous. Understand? So he supported the poetry against Puritans' attack. So the Puritans viewed poetry as a frivolous, it was worthless, valueless, but he defended it. He claimed that poetry combines teaching and delight. So he said that poetry combines both teaching and delight. That was inspired by Horace dictum Doceret delectere. Doceret delectere. So this dictum, so that is this proverb was inspired by Horace dictum. So poetry combines both teaching as well as delight, that is pleasure, happiness. And he argued that poetry is superior to history. According to him, poetry is superior than to history and philosophy because it inspires virtuous actions. It inspires, the poetry inspires good actions. So that's why he argued and he supported poetry is superior to history and philosophy. Okay, superior than to history and philosophy. The next Critic is Ludovico Ariosto, whose time period started in 1474 and ended in 1533. Ludovico Ariosto's important work is Furioso. Orlando Furioso. So his important contributions are: he advocated for creative freedom in literature. So he supported for creative freedom. One should have creative freedom in literature, and So he defended that classical learning, defended blending, combining classical and medieval traditions in epic poetry. So he defended to the combining of classical and medieval traditions in epic poetry. The next critic is Torquato Tasso. Torquato Tasso, whose time period started in 1544 and ended in 1595. Torquato Tasso's important work is Discourses on the Heroic Poem, is important work of Tasso. His important contributions to Renaissance criticism is are emphasized. He emphasized on unity and decorum in epic poetry. He focused on the unity and decorum. So that politeness and dignity in epic poetry, and he supported for adherence to Aristotelian principle while embracing Christian themes. So following the Aristotelian principles, beliefs, as well as embracing so embracing accepting, welcoming the Christian themes. The next critic is Joachim du Bellay. Joachim du Bellay, so whose time period started in 1522 and ended in 1516. His important work is the defense and illustration of the French language. The defense and the illustration of the French language. His important contributions are: he advocated for the development of French as a literary language. He supported for the development of the French as a literary language, and he also supported for imitation of classical texts while fostering the national identity. So following of the classical text, as well as that promoting national identity. So these are the important critics of Renaissance criticism. So the key concepts which we find in Renaissance criticism. Now let us understand the important concepts. The first concept is imitation. That is, following critics like Sidney and Du Bellay promoted imitation of classical masters. Philip Sidney and Du Bellay, so they promoted the following of classical masters, that is, classical writers, not as a blind copy. So we should not be copying them blindly, but as a means to learn and innovate. We have to learn the classical masters texts, and we have to innovate something, we have to create new. Understand, that is the first concept which we find in the Renaissance criticism. The second concept is decorum. So that is the politeness and respectability and decency, dignity. So works should align with appropriate style, tone, and subject matter, reflecting classical ideals of propriety. Understand that correctness, that politeness, that respectability. So works, they should be put into the correct position with appropriate style, tone, and subject matter. So which reflect classical ideals, the classical models of that dignity and appropriateness, that correctness, respectability. The third concept is unity and structure. So this unity and structure was inspired by Aristotle's Poetics. So critics emphasized unity of action, time, and place in drama and narrative. So the unity and structure was inspired by Aristotle's Poetics. So they emphasized unity of action, time, and place in drama and narrative. Understand? The next concept is the poet as a creator. So Philip Sidney argued that poets are makers. So poets are makers, and he was capable of creating worlds that reflect both the divine truth and human potential. So, as according to Philip Sidney, poets are makers. They create. So they create worlds which reflect the divine truth, the pure truth, and human potential, that human ability, the human capacity. So, poet was considered as a creator, according to Philip Sidney. The next concept is vernacular literature. Vernacular, that is the native literature. So, Renaissance criticism advocated, okay, the critics advocated for the use of native languages in literary creation, in literary expression, to write, to express. So they supported for the use of, promoted for the use of native languages, and elevating them, raising them, promoting them to the status of Latin and Greek. So promoting them to the status of the Latin and Greek. We have to elevate them, raise them to the, just like how Latin and Greek language considered as a classical language. In the same manner, we have to promote our the vernacular literature and the vernacular languages, the native languages, to they okay to the status just like Latin and Greek languages. So these are the important concepts which we find in Renaissance criticism. I hope that you understand the basics of Renaissance criticism. So, if you like the content, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much.